So if you are here for my class, Compositing, What is it good for? An Introduction to Compositing. Actually, the title was actually longer. I couldn't fit it all in on the web interface. It was actually Compositing, What is it good for? Absolutely everything. So I gave this class last year, and let's do a quick class summary. And these are the general things I hear when I travel the country. And it's from people who are design visualization artists or architects who have been tasked to do design visualization. And I hear things like great rendering, but can you change the depth of field a bit further back? I want to change the color of this one object to this color. Any art design director at any firm. Or I know the deadline is in 3 hours, but can you change this and this and this and this and this? That's not a problem, right? And finally, from the design visualization professional, oh man, spent 20 hours rendering, and I got really subpar results. So, the terminal learning objectives for this class. At the end of this class, you'll be able to explain the principles of compositing, render individual layers for compositing from 3ds Max or 3ds Max Design, define critical layer types that are crucial for maximum compositing flexibility, and then begin using the high dynamic range OpenEXR image format instead of JPEG or TIFF, which I see a lot of architects and interior designers utilize. So real quick, I'm going to breeze through this real quick. This is me. This is my curriculum vitae, 15 years of experience in architecture. I also have a degree in design visualization, and I work for Autodesk Consulting for the past 6 years, and my specialization is in BIM and design visualization. Outside of Autodesk, I run a not-for-profit organization which is affiliated with the Computer Graphics Society, and I mentor high school students, college students wanting to learn design visualization for the video game industry, architecture industry, and whatnot. All right. Now that I got all of this passed, let's talk about what is Autodesk Composite. Now, just a quick show of hands so I understand my audience. How many of you, raise your hands, if you use some kind of compositing-like workflow in your practice today? Great, all of you. How many of you use Photoshop to fulfill that goal? After Effects? Smoke? Flame? Autodesk Composite? 2 people. Yay. All right. So this disclaimer. This class assumes that the attendees have a fundamental understanding of 3ds Max and 3ds Max Design. The reason why you have to have that fundamental understanding is because I have so many slides, I can't take the time to talk about some basic features. It's just assumed you know what a material editor is. It's just assumed that you know how to model. Now, how many of you knew Autodesk Composite was an actual product maintained by Autodesk? Show of hands. Only a handful of you, all right? The great thing about Autodesk Composite right now is absolutely free for download. All right, so you can go to the Autodesk Exchange Store, that's the address, and you can download Autodesk Composite 2014 for free. Also Autodesk Match Mover, which is a match moving program. So let's talk about Autodesk Composite. And years ago, when I first opened Composite, it was called Combustion, then became Toxic. Toxic became Composite. And when I first opened it up, this was my first impression. I was terrified of it. I came from an architectural background. I did 3D Studio Max when it was version 3, but I never understood the compositing application. When I went, hey, compositing, that's cool. I looked at it, opened it up. It terrified me. But that's because of the fact that I never really understood what compositing was, and it wasn't until the dawn of the digital age and all the visual effects happening and the Blu-ray came out, and I'm sorry, the DVD came out and they're showing the making of, that I started really understanding what compositing is and how powerful it is in a workflow. So simply put, for those who just need a refresher of what Autodesk Composite is, if you've never heard of it, it is a node-based compositor. So what it basically does is it takes different visual elements from separate sources into a new single image, and you're going to composite those elements together to be able to create a particular effect, whether or not it's dramatic, or you want to change lighting, or the coloring. That's the intent of compositing. It can include a wide variety of formats that you're compositing in. It could be still images, live action shots on the green screen. It could be computer graphic animation, all right? But the typical application through my travels has always been in film, TV, computer games, When I see architects and engineers, many times I see them still utilizing Photoshop to meet their compositing needs, which is fine. It's a great workflow. I use Adobe Photoshop all the time. But what kills me is when I see them have a final render and they go, I need to change the color of that, so I will cut that out, copy to a new layer, and then change it, and I'll start deleting some things so it kind of composites in. That's what I typically see. And I feel bad for them because of the fact that they're utilizing 3D Studio Max and they already have at their fingertips abilities to go into a pure compositing workflow. So from a tool standpoint, just so you have a general idea, when I say node-based workflow, Autodesk Composite have a variety of nodes. So we see on the top right, we see a variety of various tools. And when I bring it into my workspace, I have a general node created, and it's a very simple concept. Information goes in from the left, and this tool does something specifically, and it outputs a particular information with a desired effect, whether or not it's a color change or it's some kind of lens flare effect. That's what the tool is meant to do. So here's an extended image of the general concept. So here is, here is a series of nodes with images coming in. Here's a diffuse channel, and when I say diffuse, it's just the basic colors. And then there is a lighting channel, which is just talking about the lighting. And as you can see, this particular tool called the Blend Composition tool, its sole purpose is to marry those images together and give you a new image. The great thing about it is I'm not doing a Photoshop workflow. I'm not copying, I'm not clipping, I'm not putting onto a new layer. I have all these assets already rendered out for my 3D Studio Max. Now, I say 3D Studio Max, but I just want to be clear. You could utilize Maya, Softimage, Lightwave to be able to do the same type of workflow. The technology and the methodology is consistent. And then further down in the pipeline, we see this image coming in with another image, a background plate in this case, and this is my final result. So a very, very simple diagram of how this works. So when I realized this, I fell in love with it immediately, and I wanted to know everything I could possibly learn about it. And I became back then, the toxic evangelist when I was at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And that's because of the fact that at one point I got tired of hearing the architectural principal going, hey, you know what? That material looks great, but if it was pink instead of green, it'd be better, right? And I go, oh God. But then I learned compositing techniques, and I could actually give to the principal what he wanted. Can I change this in 3 minutes? Why, yes, sir, I can, because I anticipated that you were going to change that wall. So some key takeaways from 3D Studio Max. I'm going to talk about this very, very briefly because of the fact that this is half of the part of compositing that you have to understand. So how many people utilize 3D Studio Max in this room? Be it design. Most everybody. Fantastic. Maya? All right. How many utilize Mental Ray as a rendering engine? Scanline? iRay? V-Ray? All right. So even for you V-Ray people, the compositing workflow holds true. So you're pretty savvy at rendering in Max. What render elements do you typically use? And when I ask that question in my travel, a lot of blank faces look back and go, what do you mean by rendering elements, Marcus? So if you do not understand rendering elements, pay attention, because I'm going to do a real quick crash course into it, because of the fact that if you fail to understand this, your career in compositing will come to a drastic halt. So if I go into the rendering dialog in 3D Studio Max Design, under the Render Elements tab, there is a function called Add or Merge Elements, and this is the key interface that you need to be aware of. A lot of people aren't aware. They go, oh, I don't know what that is. But why this is pertinent is when 3D Studio Max renders out and does all the computations from a lighting standpoint, from a shadowing standpoint, from a reflection standpoint, it's computing all that information. What this interface allows you to do when you render it out, to put it out into separate layers automatically. So if I can do that, part of my compositing workflow is complete. But there is one important thing that you must remember about how we send out the layers. I can't haphazardly do it. I have to have a specific purpose in mind. And some of these elements have a particular purpose. So let's talk about some of the critical ones. So we have, and these are what I recommend as if you start compositing with 3D Studio Max, these are the fundamental ones that you must understand. If you don't have an understanding of this, it's not going to look very good. So the typical ones are diffuse at the top left-hand corner. All it is the basic colors, no shading. It's just a plain RGB color value. Then we have the reflection. The reflection is only that which is reflected off. The AO stands for ambient occlusion. That is the soft shadows that's generated when lighting calculations happen. The lighting is how it understands the high intensity value, the medium intensity value of the light as it hits the surface. The refraction, how light bends through transparent objects. Z depth. How many of you are familiar with Z depth? Fantastic. For the 3 or 4 people who don't know what it is, this is like an MRI scanner. This is an image file that a 3D program can understand the depth value of an image. And based on that, you can do a lot of things, like a depth of field. So if you actually render out your images with a depth of field today and realize, oh my gosh, the depth of field just changed because the partner wants to change, this, my friend, will change your life. Finally, shadows, all right? How the shadows interact. Specular, the high intensity light points, all right? And these are the basic recommended rendering elements that you must be aware of. Now, there's one I do want to bring particular attention to. It's called the matte render element. And I remember years ago when I first saw it, I'm like, what is this? Why would I want to do this? But the matte rendering element is actually, arguably, the most important render element for a couple of reasons. The matte element can be assigned to max objects, so that's a key critical point. So any max object I have, I could create a matte render element and say, hey, I want you to create an element based upon this object assignment. But I can use it for isolating rendering elements, as well as it can be used as a mask, and also can be used temporarily as an alpha channel. Incredibly powerful and flexible, if you know those terms. Now, the other thing I want to bring to your attention is the EXR file format. So I want to thank you, George Lucas, for Star Wars and the EXR file format. So how many of you guys utilize EXR file formats today? Oh, that breaks my heart. So after this class, you will never go back to using JPEGs or TIFFs. All right? And this is the reason why. For those who do not know what an EXR file format is, historically it was created by Industrial Light and Magic, ILM. That's why I said thank you, George Lucas, for Star Wars and the EXR file format. A quick explanation of what an EXR file format is. It supports a full float 32-bit system when it comes to pixels. That sounded like gibberish, right? So what do I mean by a full float 32-bit? So quick explanation. At the bottom left-hand corner, you see the contrast ratio, and consider that the values of any color. And if we look at any type of computer program, whether or not it's AutoCAD, 3D Studio Max, there's a value range from 0 to 255. That's basic knowledge, right? So for R and G and B, and the combination of those values is what mixes a color. The thing about it is, the 8-bit world, which is typically JPEGs, I can only specify one particular value. So in this example, if I have an R value of 155, that's it. So if I do the brightness contrast, I want to make it brighter, it goes to 156. A little bit more brighter, then it goes 157. But in the case of the open EXR format, in the 32-bit world, we have decimal places in between. I go from a limited palette to million upon millions of different colors. So when I am going from 155 to 156 and doing my value adjustments, brightness contrast, I'm not going from 155 full to 156. I may be spanning 155.39, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, allows me to have a greater color depth. And that gives you flexibility. How many of you have tried to adjust the brightness contrast in the Photoshop exercise and go, all right, I'm going to make it brighter, it's too blown out. I'm going to make it darker. It's too dark. I'm losing the details. In the 32-bit world, you maintain the details while adjusting the values. That's why the EXR file format is so important in a compositing world, because you want to have those tweaks. So where do we access the EXR file format? So when we actually render out something, hit render, we sit and stare at the little percentage bar going across. When it finishes, all right, we have the option to save, and it's nothing more than a pull-down menu, and I specify an EXR file format. But one area that you have to worry about is right here, under Setup, there's an Open EXR configuration. Now, these line item listings are all the actual render elements that you can assign in the previous menu I showed you. Okay? So the reason why it is, this is your chance to go, I really don't need that, I do need that, maybe I need to add something else. You're going to tell the OpenEXR when it chugs that information, what render elements it should care about. All right? Now, there is a little cloud with an exclamation point, gamma. This is in reference to the gamma LUT value. How many of you are familiar with the gamma? Oh, good. Most of you are. Gamma is very, very important. Now, in 3D Studio Max, typically, the default setting is the automatic recommended, and most file formats like TIFFs, JPEGs, PNGs, it goes, all right, gamma LUT value 2.2. I'll do a swap if it's not and normalize it to 2.2. In the case of the OpenEXR format, because of the fact that it was developed for the film and TV industry, they wanted to have the ability to assign whatever gamma LUT value you wanted on the fly. So this is the most important thing. If you fail to pay attention, you go use OpenEXR tomorrow. Remember this one thing, I say danger Will Robinson. For compositing, maintain gamma discipline, save files to automatic gamma in most cases. For EXR, specify gamma 2.2. Do not mess this up, because if you mess this up, it's going to come out way too dark, and you can go, Marcus Kim on that stage was a liar. He told me to use this OpenEXR. I spent 30 hours rendering, and I came out with a very dark rendering. The problem is the gamma value. Okay? So let's talk about compositing. Now that I've given you the crash course, let's talk about it. Why is it important? What does it mean? Before I show the next slide, last year's comment, my class was very well received. However, the feedback I got was, Marcus, your classes were awesome, your topic was awesome, you were very knowledgeable, but your data sets were boring as hell. They were so boring that I wanted to fall asleep. But the information was good. And so when Autodesk University asked me to give the class again, it was under the caveat that I improved my data sets. I've worked feverishly to provide to you the Battlestar Galactica. So I called it the Battlestar Maximus because of the fact that I found out my son was a boy when I was teaching that class last year. His name is Max, so I called it the Battlestar Maximus. And let's talk about compositing. On the left is a standard rendering from 3D Studio Max. All right, and this is default what came out after I hit the render button and waited about 15 minutes for this to render. And what on the right is what I did after compositing. As you can see, I put Jupiter in the background, right? If you actually, the lights were down a little bit, you'll actually see a color shift. You'll actually see a lighting effect happening. And the specular highlight hue is different. Here's another example. On the left is rendered straight out of Max. On the right is the compositing from a post-processing standpoint. All of this was done with Autodesk Composite and 3D Studio Max. Strikingly different, aren't the images, right? This, left versus right. This, left versus right. All right? But the important thing also is compositing can also make a subpar rendering acceptable. How many of you have rendered for 20 some odd hours only to find out, oh God, that rendering is just horrible. The specular highlights are way off. It's super washed out. I'm going to have to re-render it. In the compositing world, because you are rendering out those various elements, specular highlight is just a layer. In a compositing application, I could dial that back down. So it gives me the ability that if I completely butcher my rendering exercise, if I use rendering elements, I could utilize those elements in a compositing program to dial it back and put it into a more acceptable format. And the important thing about compositing workflows, and I'm about to demonstrate right now, is not just for 2D images. It's also for 2D still images. It's also for animations as well, as you can see right here. You see how it's drastically different, right? It was the same rendered animation, but one is how it came out natively from 3D Studio Max. The other is what I did with the compositing program to adjust. I purposely rendered it out so it looked washed out and then corrected it in the compositing workflow. So I said that compositing is not just for still images. So here's an example of all the various channels working independently. So this is the same animation sequence you saw. You saw what it was before I composited. Now I'm going to show, and I showed you what it looks like after I did the compositing. I'm going to show you the various channels I talked about, the various elements, and how that interact. So if I were to play this, you can see the various elements in uniform, in sync. Let's take a look at that again. So the diffuse, basic colors, the lighting, the shadow, the ambient occlusion, the Z-depth. I had a particular element called the self-illumination element. And that particular one I didn't show you because it's not a critical one, but I like to render it out when I actually have self-illuminated materials because it allows me to target those out and be able to do my lighting effects more accurately. Right? And there are a lot of elements you can choose from. So I'm going to do a practical demonstration and actually kind of show you the workflow so you understand. All right? The whole intent is the following. Let me change from tablet to PC. Wake up, computer. There we go. All right, so I'm going to work myself backwards. So this is Autodesk Composite. That was one of the images I showed you, okay? And that was me after compositing it, all right? So this is our end goal. So let's talk about from work backwards. Go back to 3D Studio Max. And here's my 3D Studio Max model. I rigged it, I lit it, put an animation sequence behind it, and then I want to render it out. So just to show you from a render element standpoint, let me actually bring up my render dialogues. All right, I'm not going to talk about any of the common parameters. You should be well aware of that. So I do want to talk about the Render Elements tab right there. Currently, it's empty. There's nothing assigned. All right? It's just a simple matter of assigning it. And when I say add, look at all the various possible render elements. Now, for you V-Ray users, if you have V-Ray installed, what you will actually see, where you see MRAND level diffuse, you'll see something very similar, V-Ray diffuse. So for you V-Ray users, if you have V-Ray, do not use the basic ones. Be sure to utilize the V-Ray render elements. So it's now really a matter of me assigning which one of these render elements I want. So let's talk about all the basic ones. I said, hey, I want to use diffuse. Fantastic. All right? Or I can do multi-select. Oh, I know that I need the from here, the specular, I want the ambient occlusion maybe. Let's do the reflections. This particular ambient occlusion one, I'm not a big fan of it. I'll show you a different way of doing it. Oh, I need the self-illumination. Maybe I want the shadows back here. I want the Z depth. All right, I could pick it, multiple, and say OK. It adds to it, okay? Now, a couple obscure ones, I said matte. The matte one is very important. And when I say okay, I'm not done. Some of these you have to do a little bit further to it. So in the case of the mat, we discussed what it's meant to do. It's meant to isolate objects. You can assign objects to a mat channel. Well, it's all a matter of, at this point, with mat selected, okay, there's an option to include, or I can assign it by material ID or object ID, if you're familiar with that workflow. But if I do the include option, what really helps, and I purposely did this, is box 01, box 05, box 07 is meaningless. So there is, as part of the compositing workflow, be aware of things like naming conventions and standards so you can identify your parts. So the part I actually specified, okay, let's see, I believe I have, there you go. I want to add that. It's the belly of my spaceship. I specifically called it that so I can isolate it. Maybe I want to change the value to it. I'll say okay. And then maybe I want to have a different one. So mat, if I combine the belly and the flight pods, we'll consider as one mat. So if I want to have separate objects identified, I could add additional mat elements. So let me do one more. All right, I'll say add, and here we go, include, and in this case, I will do the left flight pod. All right, so I'm kind of setting myself up. So maybe I know for a fact that the partner who's looking at the design director, he was always dissatisfied with the color of the left flight pod. I'm anticipating him changing it on me, so I am strategically setting this mat up that when he wants to change the color, I have a way to quickly isolate it and then change the color through a compositing program on the fly. The last obscure one I want to talk about is called a shader. Okay, it's called a shader element. My glasses are not working for me. MR shader element, thank you very much. I got new glasses and wreaking havoc. All right, so in regards to the MR shader element, how many of you are familiar with a concept called a shader? Oh, good, half of you. So for the people in the room who don't know, shaders are basically computational algorithms designed to do a specific visual task, whether or not it's calculating how shadows fall, how reflectivity happens. In the case of this particular shader, what I want to do is associate it to an ambient occlusion shader. And in regards to the ambient occlusion shader, if I bring up my material panel, I have an ambient occlusion shader already ready to go. I can assign to it, but I don't really have to do anything. I didn't create this, a weird thing. The actual shader is provided out of the box. All right, let me actually pull up the maps for not the standard, but on the mental array. It's just right there, the ambient occlusion shader. The only thing I have to worry about once I drag and drop in my material editor is to give some metrics. So if I double click on it, I see some metrics in regards to this. What I really care is I care about the max distance of how the shadow is going to fall because of the fact that this is actually, I model the ship to real scale. I have to make sure that the numbers are pretty high because in fact if the numbers are too low, I may have a 30-foot span between major ribs on the ship. So I decided at this point, okay, well maybe I want the max distance spread to be 50. It will allow me to have a good optimal coverage on my ship and the ambient occlusion will come up. No, I don't want you boxing. Yeah, there we go. And the only thing I need to do at this point is now that I have a shader available, under the MR shader element, I have to just assign the shader. So you see this space where it says shader none? All I'm going to do is just assign it right there. Now I'll say instance, so whatever I do in the material editor follows suit. So this shader is ready to go, and when I render it out, it's going to do an ambient occlusion element pass for me. All right? So if you want a specific element for reflection, I could put a reflection shader. If you have a cool reflection shader you found because of the fact that it gives you the bling that you want on your metallics, as long as you have that shader, you could assign it to the shader element, and then it will spit it out as its own independent element. So there is a lot of flexibility, right? I could pick and choose what I want, but if I'm strategic about it, I could actually set myself up for maximum flexibility. If I can anticipate the change, I can make sure that when the change comes, I have the ability to, instead of taking a 3-hour Photoshop exercise, I could make the change in mere seconds. So I'm going to render this out real quick, just so you see what happens. And I set the resolution really, really low, so it should take about 45 seconds, but I think it's worth seeing how it renders out. Yeah, 320 by 180. Let me close this. There it goes. Boom, 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 boom. Here's the top view. Awesome. It's rendering out. And it's done. Boom. You see all those windows that popped up? These are the various elements. So here is my ambient occlusion. Now, in some of these elements, they're going to look pure black, and that's because of the fact that your display from the render preview in Max is only an 8-bit system. All right? So I actually need a 32-bit viewer to see it accurately. But don't worry, when I show the actual compositing demo, these black ones will actually come to life. All right? So this one is actually a specular one. Let's start closing some of this. This is another one, a Z-depth. You can only see that really in the 32-bit. Shadow display, okay, 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 okay. And here's my diffuse. Now, because of the fact that this is very, very low quality, I actually pre-rendered out the scenes in 1080p so we could actually appreciate what these various elements look like. So now let's jump over to, actually before we jump over, just so I show you the OpenEXR, typically from a workflow standpoint, I always say save to file. I'll go to files. When it opens up, I'll navigate to the folder structure that I want. Here it is. Let me go to a specific one. I'll say, hey, I want to do this. I want to bring up the setup. Specifically, oops, let me specify OpenEXR first. There it is. Setup. Fantastic. Now, this is the part that's important. Notice that this right here is the render elements. I have to make sure that I add render elements I assigned, so the OpenEXR file format knows what elements to grab when it renders. All I need to do is select those, add it, nothing more. That's the only thing you have to be aware of. Say OK. And the only other thing I want to worry about before I say hit save is this gamma override. I want to make sure it's 2.2. All right, I cannot stress that enough. Burn that into your heads. Gamma 2.2 for OpenEXR. And then I'll hit save. So the reason why I like doing this is because of the fact that when it automatically saves, I don't like looking at the computer screen. I just want to make sure it processes and saves. In the case of the OpenEXR file format for animation, this is also another critical point. If you ever do an animation render, a typical AVI format, what Max actually does is calculate the entire animation and spits it out at the end, right? It's just one file. In the case of OpenEXR, it's typically what? Industry standard for film is 24 frames per second. I think TV is it's obscure. It's like 22.18 or something like that. Can't remember off the top of my head. But the reason why this is important is let me actually show you one of my folders where I saved out the animation clip. And you would be actually surprised. So here is my Battlestar, and here is my render output, and here is that the Battlestar animation. So I had 300 frames. So what it's going to do is render out each individual frame. And the reason why it wants to do that is from a compositing standpoint, this is the win, because you have full pixel control per frame. In regards to a lot of animation, from a post-processing standpoint, it may put a blur effect in. But from a compositing standpoint, that's horrible, because I want the clarity and the crystal cleanness of all my pixels when I'm compositing. The compositor has a tool that puts in the motion blur in. So why render it or have it render that? Or a depth of field. That's another big one. A lot of people go, oh yes, it must look realistic, so I am going to render with it a depth of field effect. From a compositing standpoint, you just hose yourself. Once that is done, you cannot ever change that, especially when you have a tool in your compositor that allows you to do depth of field and adjust it on the fly. So if you have someone go, oh, the depth of field is wrong, I want more of a focus on that tower instead of the garden, the depth of field needs to change. The Z-depth channel that I showed you will give you and empower you to do so. So by saving, as OpenEXR crunches, it's going to automatically name it, and then it's going to sequence it 001, 002, 003. That represents the file format. Now, the high-end compositors, and by no means is Autodesk Composite the most high-end compositor. It used to be at one point, all right? But we have Autodesk Smoke, if you really get into compositing. I mean, that's the tool to go, all right? Or is there maybe After Effects enthusiasts who like to composite in Adobe After Effects, all right? Things are very, very similar. In a workflow standpoint, tools are very similar. The only thing Autodesk Composite is missing right now, and it will never happen because of the fact that we discontinued developing it, we just give it to you for free, it doesn't have a 3D workspace like the newer compositors. But continuing on with this, let's actually go to the composite side. All right, and so our end goal now, remember, is this. But let's actually start from the very, very beginning. All right, and I'll start from the way beginning. When I open Composite, obviously I want to start a file. So in regards to the Autodesk Composite, one of the couple key elements I want to talk about. A great thing about composite workflow, it's considered a non-destructive workflow. And when I say non-destructive, I'm never actually changing my source material. All right, so that's always maintained. I can't butcher it. I can't accidentally change the gamma on it. It's non-destructive. I could always go back to and hit the reset button. It will go back to the default configuration of what that image file is or the animation clip is. So that's what's powerful about it. So to be able to set it up, really what Composite wants to do is I want to have a file. It's just going to reference a whole bunch of information. I have a whole load of tools that can manipulate it once it comes in, but I'm never touching the source file, referencing it, I'll do whatever it is. So let's set up our database in regards to this in our project, and simply file new. And you'll get used to this actual interface when you begin. But it's a simple matter of, hey, where do I want to save this file? Hey, I think I will put it on my desktop, and I will put it in my Battlestar folder, specifically in the render outputs. Hey, there it is. And I will call this new composite. Okay? Excuse me. Now, the other important thing is now that I have started it, I get an initial node called the output node. So this is your basic thing. This is your end result node. So I need to start bringing the information in. All right? So if I want to bring the information in, it's simply a matter of saying file import. All right? And let's say I want to bring in the, let me bring in the HDR composition that I have, a high dynamic range. And I have a really good one. Let's actually look at the, we'll do the glossy rear of my Battlestar. There we go. And once I have that highlighted, I will click on import. Let me move this out of the way. There it is. It came in. All right, so here it is. Now, remember I rendered all those elements out in my example, right? One file came in. That's one of the great things about the OpenEXR file format. So in the case of this high dynamic range, instead of like a handful of render elements, I have about 20 different render elements in it. All right? And it's all compiled in the EXR file, and that's the advantage of the 32-bit system. So if I want to do a compositing workflow, I don't have to deal with 32 individual files. It's one EXR file. That's what makes it very, very flexible. So how do I change it? Here it is. I double click it to see, okay, I have a preview of it. That's what it looks like. Okay? This is my viewport. If I highlight this, this is what it's showing. If I click away from it, it's empty because it's not referencing anything. But let's go back to this again. And let me go to options. And under the channel view, here are all the various rendering elements that I crunched with my OpenEXR. So, hey, I want to see what the diffuse channel looks like. Oh, there it is. That's just the basic colors. Oh, I wonder what the lighting channel looks like. Let me actually do the one that came out black, like the specular ones typically, not the specular ones, but let's say the ambient occlusion ones typically come out really black. There it is. All right, from a 32-bit standpoint, it understands, okay, that's my ambient occlusion, there's all my soft shadow, soft light, I could see it, great, I could utilize this as a compositing asset. Let's look at the reflections. What happens when I say, hey, I want to do the output for reflections? And the little circle thing's thinking, there it is. That's just my reflections. So I have all my kit of parts in one file. So now all I need to really do is, hey, I want the diffuse. And let me go back to the diffuse because you always start with a diffuse. And as a good workflow, because of the fact that this tree of information that's compositing can get very, very complex, you want to make sure, actually, do as I say, don't do as I do, because I'm notorious for not naming my channels. But as opposed to the default name, maybe I want to change this to, hey, this is my diffuse. So it's clearly and easily identified. Now let's say that I want to bring a lighting. I'm going to copy this, paste it, and because I'm going to change this into my lighting channel, let me change this to lighting. All right, and let me switch over to it being a lighting channel. There it is. Just going to think about it for a second. There it is. There's my lighting channel. Great. This is how the light interacts with my model. All right. Now you see the little checkerboard pattern? The great thing about the OpenEXR and the 32-bit format is it understands solid blacks as an alpha. So it already cuts it all out for you. Awesome, right? You don't have to create your own masks. It just automatically does it. So now I want to combine the lighting, and I want to combine the diffuse. So this is where the nodes come in. The whole notion of nodes and utilizing nodes to manipulate two images and slap it together, have the tool do the work for you. If I utilize my middle mouse button, click on it, this is called the Gate UI. This is from the interface where I can access all the tools. If I swipe to the right, it said pick from list. On the right-hand corner, you see all the tools that are available. Specifically from a composition standpoint, if I click on this folder, here are my basic composition blending tools. Now, there are a lot of tools, but that does some obscure things, but I'm going to show you the ones that matter. Typically, the ones I'm going to show you, I use 95% of the time for most of my compositing, and I'll use some of the obscure ones for a specific tweak I'm going to do, all right? Like put in a lens flare or something like that. So what I need to do is bring from composition, the blend comp is going to be your workhorse. Swipe, blend comp, I'm going to drag, all right? I'm going to drop this in place to kind of show you. Here's my node. And so in regards to this node, there's a couple things. If I highlight over a little a pie slice that says front, that says back, and that says matte. So in regards to the matte, those are things where I'm going to use a masking channel to be able to matte things out. But really, at this point, if you understand Photoshop and how layering and stacking works, it's a very simple operation. From a node standpoint, this is my output. Remember that one slide? Input comes in from the left, outputs to the right. I'm just going to connect this to the front and connect this to the back. All right? Now notice, it doesn't seem like it's not doing anything. Oh, that's my diffuse. That's my lighting. Where it's happening is at this node. All right? So the node's going to do the work for me. But currently, It's not doing anything because of the fact that I'm going to want to bring your attention to the blend and comp under method. Notice that there's an area called blend. If I do this, what does that look like to you? Say it out loud. Photoshop, exactly. Photoshop. So if you know Photoshop, you probably know most of these. All right? So let's actually have the blend comp tool do the work. Typically, when I do lighting and diffuse, I'll use one of three, depending on the look and feel I'm trying to get. I'll either use a multiply, okay? Or I may use a add, change the look and feel, right? Made it dramatically brighter. So if I want to have a very nice, bright, happy ship, I may do it that way. And then overlay. That's the mid-range. So I want my Battlestar to be a very strong and imposing ship, Battlestar Maximus. So I will do not add, but multiply. All right, so this is my basic framework. Now, under the output section, if I connect this, the output channel is going to show, this is what's going to finally look like. If I decide to finalize my composition, the output from the node has the tools to export this out into a new image file or a new animation clip. All right? But before I get there, let's talk about some of the other tools. So let's say that I want this, hey, I want to bring in the specular. So let me copy this. Here it is. I will rename this my specular. And I need to change the channel to the specular channel. So I'll go to options, go to the pull-down menu. Here it is, MD output specular. Now I also did the diffuse ones. I'm going to show you the difference with some of them. There's one, people get confused. Like there is a level specular. I'll show you what that looks like. There it is. So what the level specular is going to do is actually kind of figures out, hey, here's the average value. This is kind of how it generically does a specular light. So do not get confused with it. When you experiment, understand the difference that the diffuse specular will do something uniquely different from the output specular. So in most cases, from a specular highlight standpoint, I will always want to utilize the output specular. So let me change that to output specular. Thinking? And there it is. So here are all the specular high light value. Where it is black, that is information that's not getting any specular highlight because of the fact that there's an object to cut the transparency in place for me. So at this point, I want to combine what the specular information is saying versus, at this point, my blend comp combine the lighting and the diffuse. So let me sever this connection. So what I want to do is the output of this and the output of this will go into a new node to be able to do the combination. So in this case, our workhorse blend comp comes into place. Here's my gate UI, swipe to the right. Here's my blend comp. I'll drop this. I could actually, this is called right here, right there. Doesn't look like it's not doing anything. But before, remember what I said in regards to the various method. Here it is. I have to specify a methodology and how the tool is going to composite those two images together. So in regards to large areas of black with high points of light, the typical one that you always use is this green. All right? So let's take a look at what it did. Here is with the specular. Here is without the specular. See that nice subtle change. Okay? Let me do one more. I will do this. I'll put in the reflection. Let me go to the options, at which point I want to do this one. I want the output reflections. There you go. And let me bring another blend comp. This time I'm going to use a thing called the kissing. When I bring it in, when I touch it, the nodes connect. I didn't come up with a term. Right, so if I want to sever that, it's typically Control. You see the pair of scissors. So let's connect those again. All right, so large areas of black, I have my reflection. So once again, I would be utilizing my screen. So this is just the reflection. That is with the reflection built in. This is without it. So notice it's starting to come to life. Now, without me having to demonstrate here, utilize a blend comp, blend comp, blend comp, let me fast forward to the file that I completely stitched together, and then I'll talk about all the other various nodes that are pertinent to you. So my end goal is that image on the left. All right? So let's kind of look at the workflow. This should make sense to you. Here's my light, here's my diffuse, my blend comp came together, spit out that image. And then here's my reflection, I use screen, it spit out that image. I want to bring your attention to this thing called the color correction histogram. So what this tool is meant to do, notice what happens, it darkens it. So the reason why I said is, well, this looks good, but I want it to be a tad darker. So there is a tool, if I swipe to the right under color correction, there's one called the color correction histogram. And all it is a slider that allows me to slide the value of how much darker I want. Let me actually demonstrate it here. Hey, I want this way dark. All right? So I can control that if I want. So it has its use. So I did that because of the fact that I wanted to get darker before I put the specular screen. There it is. I actually went a little too dark, so let me kind of tone that up. All right? And notice blend comp again. And here it is, screen. And so the next one is the shadow. And here is specifically the shadow layer that I wanted. This is just the shadow. You see where all the checker boxes are. It gets rid of all the information. It just cares about the shadow, its own separate layer. And I am going to blend it in. There it is. So here is with the shadow. Here is it without the shadow. All right? And I could actually, from this standpoint, here, let's actually kind of look at some of the options. All right, so shadow. Instead, I could use an ambient occlusion. Actually, I actually have an AO one already built in. So here's the ambient occlusion. So let's actually look at the ambient occlusion. I put the color histogram in like before, so I could control how my soft shadows interact. Oh, my soft shadows are too dark. Maybe I need to lighten it up. So correct it on the fly. So blend comp, blend comp, blend comp again. So you see the basic workflow. So here is some unique ones that I like. I champion the Z-depth. And the Z-depth is typically utilized for a depth of field effect. All right? So the gradation of what this represents is the brighter the color from 0 to 255, the wider it is, the closer it is to you. The blacker it is, the further away it is. So it's got the entire gradation of that value. So if it understands that, your compositing program understands how deep or how much depth a particular image has. So I could leverage that with a tool called blur. All right? So just to show you where that is, here it is. I believe it's under effects. Actually, no, filtering. There it is, blur. All right, I would just drag and drop it in. But here's my blend comp. This is before the blur. Here is with the blur. Notice what I decided to do was I wanted to, actually, I'll make it dramatic so you can see it. Let me actually do the blur. Let me go to the modulation. I'll show you where that is. I'm going to really tone that out. I'm going to think about it. There it is. And let me actually specify a specific area I want it to blur. There it is. Go. There it is. You really whack it out. See how it's adjusting on the fly? Or I could say that, hey, I really want the blur to happen here instead. Go, go, go. Change it right there. Okay. Oh, why don't you want to correct it? You are calling me a liar. Let's do this again. Modulation. There it is. All right. So here it is. I want to do an offset. I want to do specifically this engine pod. Think about it. Huh. Well, it's supposed to do the blur effect. I think my RAM is having trouble keeping up. So let's go back to that. Let's also talk about some of the other nifty ones. Here's me utilizing the blur effect to blur out my self-illumination. So the reason why I want to blur out my self-illumination is because of the fact that at the very end of my pipe, I want to have that glowy engine effect, right? So this is where you start becoming creative. This is only one way of doing it. There's a variety of methodologies to be able to do it. In the case of the engine effect, I specifically said, hey, I want to have this engine effect. I want to have the windows all bright and glowy. So I did the self-illumination channel. So I put a self-illumination channel in. I utilized the blur tool to blur it out. And then I utilized a glow tool to make it have a brighter point. You see that chain. But because of the fact that if I, at this point, composite it in, I start losing definition. So I put this self-illumination channel in again, and then overlaid it with my blend composition with a add effect. And now I have this sharp crispness of what the shape is, composited with the blur glowy effect. Right? So this is a compositing way of doing it. Could I have actually rendered it out like this in Max? The answer is yes. But the problem is if I rendered it out like Max, let's say that I want to change the glow to red instead of blue. Imagine what that red glow impacts. The design director says, oh, it really needs to be red. I'm telling you, it needs to be red. If it's not red, then George Lucas will fire us. All right, so because I've already accounted for that, how do I do it? Well, I have a tool to be able to do quick changes. So under the color correction, here is my color correction basics. All right, so I will say that before it goes into blur, it goes here. And from a color correction standpoint, hey, it really needs to change colors. Look at that, changing it. All right, and let's say that from the blur standpoint, now it's the red glow. So let me actually copy this, because I want to do the same thing right here. All right, and now I have the red engine effect. Very, very simple correction. How long did it take me? Seconds. Seconds. But because of the fact that I had it as a channel, as an independent element, and how the glow is impacting the lighting effect, and it's a separate entity, I'm capable of making sweeping changes very, very quickly and very dynamically without wanting to slip my wrist and having to do a 4-hour cutting and pasting exercise. So at the very end, I think I'm actually running out of time. When I get to this point, my end result becomes this particular image. So remember my original image had that nice blue engine effect. Hey, George Lucas wanted a red engine effect. Hey, thank you, no problem. I thought ahead, changed it. Okay? So from an output standpoint, I guess I have to show you guys how to output this information. From the output node, actually, you know what? I have, this class goes, it's 90 minutes, not an hour. So actually, we have another 30 minutes. Phew, I thought I was totally hosed. So I actually kind of tone back and go back a few steps. So hold that thought on the output. Let's actually talk about the mats. Remember I said the mats were arguably the most important channel. All right, and that's because of the fact that the mats allow me to target out objects, target out material assignments, allow me to target out even particle systems. I could create a mat for a particle system. How many of you guys are familiar with particle systems? Fantastic, right? So particle system is one of those biggest things that if I do not have set up correctly, I render and commit that particle system may completely mess me over because somebody didn't like the light, like how it looked. But from a compositing exercise, it's its own separate channel. I could change it on the fly, change the color of it. Hey, it's not blurry enough. Hey, I have a blur tool to blur it out more. It's not crisp enough. I have a reverse blur, that sharpen tool that sharpens everything back up. But going to the mat, let's say that in regards to this particular one, let's see what mat channels I have available. Copy this over. Give it a second to think. All right. So here's my mat channel. I'm going to go to the options, and actually I'm going to go to, I've created a variety of mats, and the mat I care about specifically, now I'm working for James Cameron. James Cameron goes, you know, the flight pod has a very distinctive red component to it for the entranceway. Red is my most hateful color. I want you to isolate that one in all 10,000 frames and change it to teal or purple or whatever the color may be. Now, from a Photoshop standpoint, virtually impossible, 24 frames per second. From a compositing standpoint, because as it rendered it out, I created that mat. I can actually specify, here is the red trim mat. There it is. Isolated it out. Boom. That's just that particular material. Or if I want to change the entire flight pod, well, I created a mat for that too. Here's the flight pod. There it is. I isolated that object uniquely. It understands what that is. So from a color correction standpoint, I could say that, well, you know what? At this point in the game, let's go back to here. All right, and I will put in at this point, hey, I'm pretty happy with what that looks, but the flight pod needs to change a different set of color. So I am going to put in between here and go here, I'm going to put in a color correction node. So swipe, here it is, my color basics. I'm going to put that in here. Pan and zoom, kind of jockey this around a little bit so I have some, that's the one I want. Here it is. Let me sever this connection. And let me string this up. Here is the important one. And here is my output going into this. Now, right now, it's not doing any color correction. So here it is. If I want to do the color correction, you saw me do it before. Notice I'm changing the entire battle star, right? That's because of the fact that I am not leveraging my mat to just isolate the flight pod. So if I were to bring in the flight pod, here it is. You see this dark one, here's my masking region. So I can say the output goes here. All right, now let's do this. It's not going to do it just yet because I have to actually do a setting for it. So in regards to my flight pod, what it's having issues with is because of the fact from the output is RGBA, and the RGB is saying, hey, look at the red value, the green value, the blue value, but also look at the alpha channel value. And because the alpha channel value considers the black nothing, that's the reason why the color is completely shifting. So what I have to do is just saying, well, you know what? I really just want to call this RGB. Okay? Let's make sure I got this. Come on, catch up, computer. Yeah, there we go. I want the RGB. There it goes. You do not want to cooperate with me because I'm going to connect again. All right, let's do this one more time. All right, so image, CC Basics option, masking. I want, there it is. There it is. Notice how the hue is different. I actually connected it. I was actually looking at the RGB value in the wrong node. I was actually in the actual source image, not the mask. So notice at this point, my flight pod has become red. And if I go, oh, well, you know, the flight pod really needs to be something else. I really want the flight pod at this point to be, let me go set this correct again. All right. So here it is, my blend comp. CC Basics. All right, I want to go, let's go here. Set this back to RGB. Think about it. So while it's thinking, one comment I do want to make, I'm doing this on a laptop. Ideally, you want to do a compositing workflow on a workstation. So I have a whole mighty 8 gigs of RAM, so it's struggling. So in regards to this, I want to change the color of it, and it's really a matter of me at this point. Hey, I want to change this around. I want to bring that in. Hey, let's rotate this to change the value. All right, so you get the general idea. So I can create a mask for any one of my objects and make sure that I can isolate things, change color things, I can blur it out. I could actually I could utilize a blur tool and just blur out the flight pod, right? So I have a lot of various options that can work from a compositing standpoint. So as I start doing this, let me actually open another project because I actually want to show you from what this workflow looks like from an animation sequence, right? So this is a still image. I have one already set up for an animation. So let me actually open this up. And here is my animation. Okay. And because of the fact that it is 24 frames per second, it is 9 seconds of animation. It's actually a lot of frames. So this is in high def quality because of the fact that I just didn't have enough time to render it out at HD, but you'll understand the workflow. And notice light, right? Diffuse. Combine that. From here to there, it's that. From here to there, it's all blend comp. It becomes that. By putting in the ambient occlusion, I did the color histogram, it becomes that. All right? So at which point, if I were to start going through, let me go to frame 67, or even this frame, that information's still all there. Because of the fact that as it was rendering out, it rendered it out in channels that it could understand. It bucketized them, so even if it's a rendering workflow where it's animations involved, the compositing workflow is valid. I could do the exact same thing. I could do a color correction. I could do a blur. I could do a color histogram. I could change the ambient occlusion. I can decide, well, you know what? At the ambient occlusion phase, this particular one, you know what? I want the color histogram to be darker. Okay? There it is. For this, this versus this. Now, as a trick, I don't like toggling back and forth all the time. I actually may want to see when I do an adjustment, I may want to see what my final result is. So I can actually set my viewport by activating this, right-click. There's a display of, if I hover over here, so notice that there is a composition output versus a tool output. So by default, it's set to the hotkey number 6, which is the tool output. So it wants to show the viewport of whatever tool I am currently selected in. So if I'm in the color histogram, it'll show me what it looks like. But if I go here and say, well, you know what? I want to see the end result to this, okay? So at this point, I can start doing, okay, so from here, if I were to adjust the color histogram, let me make sure I have an output node. Here, oh, I see what's going on. Let me make sure that from here, the output of my final one's connected. There it is. And so I want to change the color histogram. Way dark, I could see how that's impacting my final result. So I have the ability to look at it and go, okay, I need to change the ambient occlusion. If I dial it up, what will it impact in my final image for that? But this is a sweeping change. It's not just for this frame. It's actually for, if I go back to this frame, it's consistent. Now, there's a whole tool set of an animation tool set because I could set the values with a keyframe and say at this particular frame, the value of it is 27 in the histogram. At frame 237, because I'm far out, because in the case of my frame 237, I'm starting to see the entire ship. I may want to dial down the ambient occlusion so it's more readable because I don't want my color histogram to be so high that it just kind of blacks my ship out. Okay, so let's see what happens from a blend comp standpoint. Let's actually go to this blend comp. But specifically, the blur effect right here, how is that going to impact my, if I really blur it out? You see what's happening? All right, so this is really meant for the lights here. You see the little glow effect. I'm not sure if you could actually see it on the screen, so let's see if I could dramatically do it. Maybe I don't want too much of a blur. All right? Or under the blend comp here, maybe I want to start changing the front gain. All right? Or maybe, let's go back here. Let me turn back to this. Maybe I want to do a color correction layer at this point. Maybe I don't want that orange light. So let me go do a CC Basics. I want to change this to a different set of lights, but let's see how that impacts my image downstream. Let's kind of zoom in to see it. Here's my CC Basics. Okay, let's actually kind of move this. Tint, let's bring. See how I'm dramatically changing that subtle component to it, just the lighting effect itself. If I had to do this simulating the glow effect with the light impacting the materials, and I was using a typical Photoshop workflow, and somebody told me I had to do that 10,000 times, I'd probably quit, right? So now that I have the bulk of this in place, here's my blur effect. Let's kind of go here. Let's see how the blur actually, from a modulation standpoint, impacts this. I could really dial it out, all right? Thinking about it. Go to the actual blur control. Let me make sure it's 0. Modulation, there it is. All right, so let's dial this back in. All right, let's actually say that I want to be more focused on that area and do a subtle change. So I have the ability to make all these sweeping changes very, very quickly, very efficiently. So what do you think of the compositing methodology? Is this more flexible in your mind than how we do in Photoshop today? Do you think Photoshop could accomplish an animation sequence? I know it's got a film strip mode, so it's very similar in concept, but can it do it? Maybe. Maybe. It would be a full-time job. So at the very end of my pipeline, though, at a certain point, I want to be able to get these images out. So all it did was a non-destructive workflow that chains all these images together. All right? And as it chains all these images together, the output is my end result. As part of my output, I want to make sure that I send it out to a format. So here it is. Let me go to the output node. Specifically, under the render tab, there's a couple of things I need to be aware of. Now, from a compositing standpoint, it's going to do is, in regards to Autodesk Composite, there is no function to go directly to an AVI or a QuickTime format. The only one it's got is .mov, and nobody likes it. And that's because of the fact that the package is a little bit old. But the best way to do it, in my opinion, with Composite is actually either send it out as an EXR or send it out as a JPEG. Because what happens is when I actually render out the process, I'll say output, I can specify where I want to save it. Let's say that I want to save this. Let's see, where's a good place? Here's my Battlestar footage. And maybe I want to put in a brand new, put it right here. Let me put in this bad animation folder. All right? And I want to actually save this, and I say, OK. And the next thing I'm going to do is go back here. What it's going to do is utilize the default name of the file and then put in whatever frame number. So when I hit render, under File, Import, I'm sorry, not File Import, but File Render, all right? I'm going from frame 1 all the way to 300. When I say Start, it's going to compile all the images together, goes through the process frame by frame, and then dump it into that folder. And if I were to look at my folder, here is my animation of just my, here it is. It's frame by frame. So the big question now is, when it renders out frame by frame, this really isn't an animation clip, right? I expect to see it as an AVI or a QuickTime. How do we go about doing that? So there's a variety of methods. For example, I myself utilize QuickTime Pro. QuickTime Pro is, I believe, and that's because of the fact that I really like the format. I have no problem giving Apple more of my money. I'll give them $30. But QuickTime Pro has the ability to stitch clips together, actual individual images, and then spit out an animation-based format. If you don't want to spend the $30, you can get Easy View. That's a free application. Has the same ability to be able to compile all the images together and then spit out an animation clip. Right? So once I actually have the image, me actually compiling this became this. Or this. And then ultimately this. But the flexibility of why I want to actually keep those individual files, because they're individual clips, then if there is a change that needs to happen based upon that current version, I have the latest raw footage by frame that could go through another compositing workflow. So I'm going to take some time to do a Q&A. But before I do that, I guess I am contractually required to, before I start my Q&A session, be sure to do your session feedback. It's very, very important. I actually tried to do this as a lab this year, but there just wasn't enough interest in it. So if you guys would love to do a compositing-like workflow as a lab and the feedback comments, please put that in there. Hey, this would make an awesome lab. Also, just remember 80, 20, 15 passes given out each day, and instructors see results in real time. So as soon as you leave, you go, Marcus sucked. I can go, oh, okay, Susan said Marcus sucked. I understand. Also, another one, students, educators, and schools, please pass this message on. Free access to Autodesk design software and apps. Fantastic deal, right? So tell the high school students who wants to be the next game developer, tell the college student who he no longer needs to pay student fee or pirate it, he just gets it for free. And also remember, earn your professional Autodesk certification AU.